Between 1955 and 1985, right here in Canada, the government removed an estimated 20,000 Indigenous children from their families. Not because those families were abusive, not because those children were in danger, but because the government decided that being Indigenous was reason enough. They called it the Sixties Scoop. And chances are, nobody ever taught you about it. Not in school, not in the news, not in your history textbook. Today, that changes. To understand the 60s Scoop, you need to understand what came before it. For decades, Canada ran what are now known as residential schools, government-funded, church-operated institutions where Indigenous children were taken from their homes, forbidden to speak their language, and stripped of their culture, and in thousands of documented cases, abused. The last one didn't close until 1996. But here's what most people don't know. While the world was slowly waking up to the horrors of residential schools, a second system was already running in parallel. Quietly, bureaucratically, legally. Child welfare agencies, mostly run by provincial governments, began sweeping into Indigenous communities, and they were removing children at a scale that had never been seen before. Between the mid-1950s and the mid-1980s, social workers would arrive at homes, often without warning, often without interpreters, and take children away. Second, poverty used as a weapon. Many Indigenous families were living in poverty, a direct result of colonial land dispossession. The criteria were vague, subjective, often rooted in racism. The home looked different. The parenting style seemed unusual. The living conditions weren't up to standard, but what those standards were actually measuring was how Indigenous a family looked. And those children? They were placed into the child welfare system, adopted or fostered out to predominantly white, non-Indigenous families across Canada, the United States, and even Europe. Many never came back. So let's talk about what actually happened, because the details matter. Where did it start? The term 60s Scoop was actually coined by researcher Patrick Johnston in a 1983 report to the Canadian Council on Social Development. He used it to describe what he called the scooping of children from reserves, particularly through the 1960s. But the practice started earlier. In British Columbia alone, the number of Indigenous children in the system rose from 29 in 1955 to nearly 1,500 by 1964. Think about that. A 5,000% increase in less than a decade. And it wasn't slowing down. By the 1970s, Indigenous children represented 30 to 40% of all children in care across Canada, despite Indigenous people making up less than 4% of the population. There are several factors, and none of them are simple. First, colonial thinking. The dominant belief in Canadian government at the time was that Indigenous culture was inferior, that Indigenous children would have better lives if they were raised in white, Christian, middle-class homes. This wasn't fringe thinking, it was policy. But instead of addressing the root causes, governments used it as justification to remove children. The poverty itself became the crime. Third, systemic ignorance. Many social workers had no training in Indigenous culture, language, or community structure. Extended family caregiving was misread as neglect. Multi-generational homes were flagged as overcrowded. Grandparents looked irregular on a form. This is where the story gets deeply personal. Children were placed with families who, in many cases, were told nothing about their background. Some adoptive families didn't even know the child was Indigenous. Birth certificates were sometimes altered. Names were changed. Many of these children grew up with no knowledge of their language, their community, their ceremonies, their identity. And when they grew up and tried to find their families, the records were incomplete, sealed, destroyed in some cases. Survivors describe a profound, specific kind of loss, what many researchers now call cultural genocide. Not the physical elimination, but the deliberate severing of children from everything that made them who they were. One survivor, Colleen Cardinal, has described it this way: you grow up not knowing where you came from, not knowing who you are, and carrying a grief you don't even have a name for. Many survivors struggled with mental health, addiction, poverty, and disconnection. Not because of who they were, but because of what was done to them. Was anyone held accountable? For decades, no. But in 2017, the legal landscape began to change significantly. In 2017, an Ontario court ruled that the federal government was liable for the harm caused to Indigenous children between 1965 and 1984. That case, Brown versus Canada, led to an $875 million class action settlement in 2018, one of the largest in Canadian history. Similar settlements followed. In 2022, the Supreme Court of Canada refused to hear an appeal from the federal government challenging those settlements. A significant moment, but survivors and advocates are clear. Money is not justice. Money does not return a language. Money does not return a mother's face. Money does not return a grandfather's voice or a community's ceremony. The damage was spiritual and cultural, far beyond financial reach. Where are we now? The Sixties Scoop didn't end the overrepresentation of Indigenous children. It transformed it. It became a new system of care. Today, Indigenous children still make up roughly 53% of children in foster care in Canada, while representing only 8% of the child population. That statistic alone should stop you cold. In 2021, the government passed Bill C-92, giving Indigenous communities greater jurisdiction. Many advocates call it a step forward. Many say it doesn't go nearly far enough to repair the structural damage. The story is not over. Here's what I want you to sit with. The 60s Scoop wasn't ancient history. It was happening during the building of the CN Tower and the Olympics. It was happening when Canada was presenting itself to the world as a tolerant, progressive nation. While your parents and grandparents were raising families, and it was happening because systems, designed by people, enforced by people, decided that some children's families were worth less. Knowing this history doesn't make you guilty, but not knowing it, when you have the chance to, that's a choice. This is the story someone buried, history that was hidden, stories that were buried, truth that someone decided you didn't need to hear. We're going to keep telling them. If this video taught you something, that's why this channel exists. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Hit that bell.